What would happen if gas just suddenly disappeared from the world? Obviously, this is not something that we've ever experienced. But this is a question that researchers have actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about. And it turns out that there are some pretty wild consequences. If all the gas in the world suddenly vanished, the effects would be felt almost instantly. Within seconds, every single gas-powered motor vehicle would come to a stop, whether they were in motion or not. The engines would simply run out of fuel. All flights would immediately be grounded because planes can only fly when surrounded by air. They need it for lift and also to keep their engines running. In other words, within seconds, every plane in the sky would plummet straight towards the Earth. But that wouldn't even be the worst part, because in addition to being unable to breathe, humans and animals alike would begin to freeze to death. This is because of something called the greenhouse effect. Basically, Earth has a protected atmosphere that keeps the planet at a comfortable temperature, but that same atmosphere also traps heat. If it suddenly vanished, then all the heat in our lower atmosphere would vanish along with it. And so, without that insulating blanket, temperatures would rapidly drop to around -18 degrees Celsius or 0 Fahrenheit. But why would that happen? After all, there is still plenty of heat in the sun. Well, think of the atmosphere like a sponge. It absorbs the energy from the sun and redistributes it all over the planet, making it habitable. But if that atmosphere were to disappear, then all the heat from the sun would only reach the surface in the areas directly exposed to it, which is why polar regions would become especially dangerous. Without the insulating atmosphere, they would experience temperatures far below 0 very quickly. And then after that, things would start getting strange. For example, at first, skyscrapers and tall buildings would continue standing strong, but eventually they too would succumb to the vacuum of space. That is because the lack of atmospheric pressure would cause the air pockets inside of solid structures to expand and implode, literally blowing them apart from the inside out. So any large structure that was anchored to its foundation would get blown over like a house of cards. The good news, however, is that water would remain liquid for quite a while since it has a relatively high boiling point. Unfortunately, that wouldn't last for long. Eventually, the remaining heat in our oceans would boil off all the water, turning Earth into a scorched wasteland. The bad news, however, is that there would be no rain to put out the fires that would surely rage across the planet, and so life as we know it would end. In fact, nothing could live on Earth anymore, including the toughest bacteria. And that's because the atmosphere contains a lot more gases than just oxygen. There is also nitrogen, which is a crucial ingredient in amino acids, the building blocks of life. Plants use nitrogen to grow, and animals eat the plants, and so on up the food chain. But without an atmosphere, Earth would become an inhospitable desert. It's hard to imagine now, but a few billion years ago, Earth's atmosphere didn't have much oxygen in it. Instead, it was full of carbon dioxide. But eventually, algae and other microorganisms started producing oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis, and eventually our atmosphere became the way that it is today. However, if gas disappeared now, then all those plants would die and the carbon dioxide levels would once again rise, leading to a runaway greenhouse effect. Since there is so much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, if it were compressed, it would make up around 20% of the planet's surface. Unfortunately, most of the carbon dioxide isn't in a compressed state. Instead, it's evenly distributed, which means that if gas disappeared, our entire planet would be covered in carbon dioxide. And the really weird thing is that since carbon dioxide is denser than air, it would weigh around 30% more. So it might feel like you're rebreathing a little bit heavier when you're actually walking on solid ground. In fact, carbon dioxide molecules are so heavy that they would sink through the cracks in the pavement and cause the roads to collapse beneath our feet. Since there would still be gravity, the carbon dioxide would pile up underground and eventually form vast oceans of compressed CO2. But here's the bizarre thing. Even though carbon dioxide is a gas at room temperature, under extreme pressures, it becomes a liquid. And at even higher pressures, it becomes a solid. So if gas disappeared, then Earth would be buried under a layer of solid carbon dioxide that would extend down several miles. And the deeper you went, the warmer it would get due to the increased atmospheric pressure. The only problem is that this so-called mantle of carbon dioxide would be extremely hostile to any life. The pressure would be thousands of times greater than at the surface, and the temperature would range between 400 and 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. In other words, it would be impossible to survive under such intense conditions. But if somehow you did manage to drill a hole through the crust of carbon dioxide and reach the center of the Earth, you would find that everything was still very much alive. That's because the inner core of our planet is a liquid ball of iron and nickel with a temperature of around 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And surprisingly, it's the temperature, not the pressure, that determines the physical state of matter. If you took a handful of carbon dioxide from the surface and lowered it to the core, it would melt and vaporize into a gas again. So you could breathe normally and maybe even enjoy the beautiful view of the molten core. But unfortunately, that would only last a few minutes. Because of the extreme heat, your body would be cooked from the inside out, and then you would die. And once you exploded into a cloud of vaporized flesh, the rising heat would melt the iron core, causing it to burst out of the planet. At that point, the Earth would be a hollowed-out shell with a thin layer of solid rock floating around in space. If the core continued accelerating outwards, it would eventually break through the crust and escape velocity. Then it would disappear into outer space forever. In fact, if gas disappeared and the core escaped, then Earth would literally cease to exist. But not everyone agrees with this assessment. Some researchers argue that without an atmosphere, the core would slow down and eventually collapse inwards, causing Earth to become a tiny neutron star only a few miles wide. Others think that the entire planet would collapse into a black hole. Either way, there wouldn't be much left of Earth, only a small singularity containing most of the planet's mass. This is something to consider next time you turn on your stove. Chances are you'll take the existence of gas for granted. But without it, we would freeze, burn, and then explode. Or alternatively, the entire planet would explode. Now you know what to blame. As you've seen, the world as we know it depends on gas, but it also depends on many other factors that we don't often think about. For example, the existence of stars and planets themselves is based on a delicate balance of physics constants. If any of these were different, then stars couldn't form and life as we know it wouldn't be possible. To learn more about the incredible odds that led to our existence, check out this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.